Look at the size of these trees. Cannot get over it.
This is Into the Mix, a Ben and Jerry's podcast about joy and justice, produced with Vox Creative. I'm Ashley C. Ford.
So I just wanted you to see where that line is called Woodland Quarters. So this is where the location of the quarters for the plantation, and their descendants are still living in this street, down the street.
Wow.
We are back in Louisiana, in St. John the Baptist Parish, just a few miles down the Mississippi River from St. James Parish, where we were with Miss Sharon last week.
When we say fence line communities, you can see how closely these homes are to plantations. Imagine if this was a petrochemical company, how it'd be right on the fence line of a petrochemical company, which has happened in so many instances.
We saw a lot of that in St. James Parish.
I'm surrounded by a grove of enormous live oaks, talking with Jo Banner at the Woodland Plantation in Laplace, Louisiana. Jo Banner and her twin sister Joy own this land. They are among the first Black people and descendants of enslaved people in Louisiana to own a former plantation.
It's unbelievable that we own it. We never thought we would be able to achieve owning a plantation. So being here means the ancestors are always calling out, they're always paying attention, and they're making it happen.
And like Miss Tish and Miss Sharon, Jo's family has been rooted in this land for a long time.
I'm from Louisiana, from St. John the Baptist Parish. I'm 10th generation in my community here. So my family's been in the area for over 300 years at this point. That comes with, for me anyway, a deep connection to the land, to the people, to the history of the area. So I've always been somewhat in love with my culture, thanks to my grandparents, who were great storytellers and communicators. So they entertained us by giving us folk tales and the folklore, and that just instilled a great love for the area.
Jo grew up on the stories of this place. One of her favorites was that of Compère Lupin, a wily rabbit known throughout the African diaspora, especially in the Caribbean and southern United States. Compère Lupin is the tale of a tricky little rabbit caught by a farmer while munching away on his crops. I'll let Jo tell the rest.
So Lapin says, well, if you're going to kill me, just please don't throw me into the briar patch. Please, that's the last place I want to die. And so the farmer's like, well, okay, if that's how you don't want to die, that's how I'm going to kill you. So he takes Compère and he throws him in the briar patch, and when Compère Lapin's in the briar patch, he looks back at the farmer and he's like, you stupid farmer, this is where my parents made me. And he just escapes through all the thorns, and then he looks back at the farmer and he, is liberated. He knows the land so well, and he tricks the farmer into releasing him into his sure path of liberation. And the farmer should have known that as a rabbit, this is where rabbits are born. Mm-hmm. But so he doesn't even know the land that he owns.
Love this story.
And that's how Joy and I, we literally say this. When we're up against industry, it's like, this is where we were born. This is where we were made. So when they try these tricks, you can't trick us. We were born here.
That's right. Jo and Joy were born here. Their grandparents and their grandparents' grandparents were born here. They know this land. They know its history. Like Compère Lupin, they know how to thrive here. This place is their briar patch. Today on Into the Mix, episode 2 of our 3-part series in Cancer Alley. This is our briar patch. Let's get into it.
It has a history that is beautiful, but at the same time painful. I'm a product of all of that. And I'm also still trying to process that and communicate the importance of my community. It has many different layers, as I mentioned before, many layers of freedom, many layers of enslavement, and all of that mixed together, which gives us this really interesting history that we're trying to preserve, trying to acknowledge first, because many parts of it is not acknowledged. At the same time, trying to preserve it and protect it from many issues like environmental racism, environmental justice.
Jo and her sister Joy are the founders of the Descendants Project, an organization committed to the healing and flourishing of Black descendant communities in the river parishes. And they work closely with the Concerned Citizens of St. John with Miss Tish and Rise St. James with Miss Sharon. The Descendants Project is focused on healing the legacies of enslavement and environmental degradation, which, to be clear, are not separate histories. When Jo and Joy were kids, a new proposed plant was confirmed in their community. A plant proposed by a foreign company, a multi-billion-dollar plant on former plantation land where their great-great-grandmother was enslaved. Sound familiar?
I remember, and I was 10 years old at the time, the conversations in our community changed. We started hearing about these people coming around and hearing about this company called Formosa.
In 1990, the very same Formosa Plastics that owns the land 2 miles from Miss Sharon's home was planning on building a rayon processing plant on the land of the former Whitney plantation in Wallace, Louisiana. The plant would literally raze Jo's neighborhood to the ground. The St. John the Baptist Parish Council rezoned several hundred acres of farmland from residential to industrial. Once again, sound familiar? The plan was abandoned in 1992 due to local opposition and EPA intervention. And then there were the extortion, money laundering, and racketeering charges aimed at the parish president, Lester Millett, in relation to the Formosa deal. Formosa leaving was a triumph for Jo's community in Wallace. It stands as an important reminder. Communities can fight against industry and win. However, the majority of that farmland has remained zoned industrial since the 90s. This essentially left Wallace open to future industrial projects.
As we are fighting this company, Greenfield, Louisiana, which is attempting to place a grain export terminal on a property of Formosa, which used to be Formosa property. So the land that was zoned heavy industry to facilitate Formosa is still zoned heavy industry, which allowed for this company, Greenfield, actually a Denver-based company, to essentially put a grain export terminal there. And grain export causes a lot of pollution, massive industry, tons of traffic, tons and tons of particulate matter, just would destroy us, would destroy Wallace. As much as Formosa would have done, this one would do it too. So we've been battling this company for 3 years.
Jo and Joy are plaintiffs in a lawsuit against the parish to revoke Wallace's industrial zoning status. The current zoning would allow future plants to build within a football field's distance from family homes. Plants like the Greenfield, Louisiana grain export terminal that Jo mentioned. Jo and Jo Banner are arguing that since the rezoning was a result of convicted criminal activity in the 90s, it should never have been upheld in the first place. It's the consequence of a 30-year-old decision they shouldn't even have to be fighting. And for Jo, it's so deeply exhausting.
We're still trying to recover from it, especially as we are fighting this zoning that was put in place to facilitate Formosa Plastic and how much damage this plant has caused and this arrangement in my parish that I love so much, and that my family, through so much pain, has still done so much to make sure that it's protected and we're protected, and we're still being violated by this entity, this beast that comes in. And I have to deal with it, and Sharon is dealing with it, and Diane in Texas is dealing with it. When is enough enough? How much damage and harm can one plant cause to so many different people? So, and I'm sorry, it's still raw for me because it's like we're literally in a court case to fight the zoning that was put in place for Formosa. Just opened this door. And we're still between these two worlds is how I live my life. So it's still just a lot of processing that I have to do and moving through all these emotions as we deal with this ghost.
Yes. Do me a favor. Don't apologize for this level of emotion. Don't apologize for feeling this way. This is your home.
Right.
These are your people. What could be more appropriate to be upset over? I don't
No,
think
you're
there
right.
is anything more appropriate to be upset over. This is incredibly appropriate for you to feel this way. So please, that's all I ask is don't
Thank you.
apologize for it.
Thank you.
Okay? Because you have this strong history here.
I'm going to say this simply. Cancer Alley would never have existed without chattel slavery in this country. Let me say it again. Black communities in the river parishes of Louisiana would not be fighting for their lives against enormous industry if white people did not decide they had the right to own another human being. I'm going to take us back for a second. Early 1800s. The large-scale monocropping of cotton and tobacco in places like Virginia and North Carolina depleted the soils and thus the economies of much of the South. In response, enslavers began selling the human beings they claimed to own to places like Mississippi and Louisiana, where sugarcane, tobacco, cotton, and indigo plantations were gaining strength. Over 1 million enslaved people from further north and east were sold with impunity down the river through Natchez, Mississippi, to what white people called the Great River Road, the land that is now Cancer Alley. So many families were torn apart, never to see their loved ones again. Farming sugarcane was even more brutal than farming cotton. Cutting and harvesting sugarcane was dangerous, and processing it from cane to sugar required boiling enormous vats in brutal heat for hours. At the height of the sugar rush, the death rate for enslaved people on these plantations exceeded the birth rate. And these people who died are the same ones whose graves are being built over by the same plants that are killing their descendants. These lands hold memories of deep, unfathomable violence. And the presence of the petrochemical industry only continues to weave that violence into the present. Here's Jo again.
Woodland Plantation is a perfect example of the connection to petrochemical companies and plantations. Petrochemical companies are in the literal footsteps of plantations. Mm-hmm. The reason why we have so much petrochemical companies is because plantations provided the land, provided the access to the river, the accommodating governmental system that looked the other way, let's be honest. So all of that, which was baked into the plantation system, is essentially what petrochemical companies used.
Post-emancipation, a lot of formerly enslaved people remain locked to plantations through sharecropping, an incredibly unfair practice that lasted well into the 20th century. When the system of sharecropping finally began to sunset, these huge former plantations started going up for sale, and not to the people who lived nearby and often worked the land.
And as the land became available, the petrochemical companies came in, bought that land, and is now in the same space. So now descendants of the enslaved who oftentimes are on a fence line of plantations are now on the fence line of petrochemical companies and are getting the most or bearing the most burden for pollution and toxins. Environmental racism issue that we see now, environmental injustice issues that we see here. In order to understand how we are and improve our conditions, I believe you must look at the slavery system. You must look at the system of exploitation, because that's what it is. Mm-hmm. Sugarcane farming, it's called farming, it's heavy industry. Taking a chemical, modifying it, processing it, literally processing it, cooking it down to form a chemical that we don't really need. Producing it at the levels that is being produced right now is not needed. And it's the same thing that's happening right now concerning production of plastic. It's the same exploitation, sacrifice zone that we now as communities are facing.
This history makes one thing very clear. Industry didn't come to the river parishes by accident. They didn't happen to build next to Black communities. They came to Cancer Alley because these communities are Black communities. We'll come right back to that after the break.
Can you describe what we're looking at, where we are?
This is Into the Mix, and I'm Ashley Seaford. Miss Sharon is driving us around the 4th and 5th districts of St. James Parish on what she's dubbed a toxic tour. As we drive, Miss Sharon points out how the industry has embedded itself in the landscape and the homes of her neighbors.
A lady in that house died with cancer. I used to teach school with her. My uncle back there had cancer and his wife too. In this trailer right here. The man over here named Bud, he died with cancer. And Janice lived right down there, she had breast cancer. The lady back here died with cancer.
Sharon, do you feel like in your mind you have a map of sickness and death around these tanks of people who you know who have either gotten sick or passed?
Yes.
It feels like every house that we pass, Miss Sharon knows of someone who lived there that is sick or has died. It's as if we are walking together through a graveyard reading the names off headstones. At one point, Miss Sharon points to a sign on the side of the road. We pull off to read it.
This is an area in the 5th district in St. James Parish, and it's called Freetown. The street is named Freetown, and that's where some of our enslaved ancestors were. Enslaved back down the street right here.
Free towns, freedom towns, or freedmen towns were and are communities all across the country where free Black people built homes before and after the abolition of slavery. Most of these towns thrived by many measures. They often had strong social services led by community, Black people in leadership and positions of change, and many Black landowners. Following abolition, during Reconstruction, the Federal Freedmen's Bureau planned to repatriate plantation land to formerly enslaved people along the lower Mississippi. At least, that was its intention. In actuality, only small slivers of land along the edges of much larger former plantations were broken up for formerly enslaved families, while most of the land remained in the hands of white planters. Many of these formerly enslaved people remained right next to the land they were enslaved upon, tied to it by the system of sharecropping. The result was huge blocks of land separated by Black communities, which is how the region mostly remains to this day.
The petrochemical companies came in, bought that land, and is now in the same space. Now, descendants of the enslaved who oftentimes are on a fence line of plantations are now on the fence line of petrochemical companies and are getting the most, or bearing the most burden for pollution and toxins. We want to show that connection here, is in addition to communicating the history that happened here, how it ties into this environmental racism issue that we see now, environmental injustice issues that we see here. In order to understand how we are and improve our conditions, at least with the environment, you have to, at least I believe, you must look at the slavery system. You must look at the system of exploitation, because that's what it is.
Those huge swaths of land left in the hands of white landowners have mostly been maintained for the plantation tourism industry or farmed for sugarcane. However, in many cases, these lands are sold in multi-million to billion-dollar sales to the fossil fuel and petrochemical industry.
It's a common, the common settlement pattern is along the long edges of the plantations after abolition, that people would settle just on the margins of the plantation lands.
Mm-hmm.
This is Adam Dorenwin. He is a member of Rise St. James and a doctoral candidate in geography at Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge. While we talked with Miss Sharon in her living room, Adam and a few other Rise members came in and out.
Hey, Adam, come on in.
How's it going?
Have a seat. It's going good.
Good.
So, can you ask the question again?
Yeah, essentially. Sitting in Miss Sharon's living room, the place where Rise St. James started, there's a constant stream of cars pulling up in the driveway, front door slams, and constant ringing from her multiple
That one
phones.
is. That might be Pete. Oh, she always call me. Don't know that number. It's a 985 number.
That ain't Penny.
I don't know who that is. I don't know why they keep calling early in the morning.
Rise St. James' power is in these phone calls and door slams. It's in the community Miss Sharon has forged around her. Adam was welcomed into that community after he met Miss Sharon at LSU, where she was giving a talk.
Excuse my Cajun French, but Miss Sharon is a badass. Sharon is a badass, and that's good. That's important. Making trouble is important, right?
Adam joined us on the Toxic Tour. In addition to organizing with Rise St. James, he's studying the complicated historical, political, and social dynamics of this land. Dynamics like how industrial lots and neighborhoods run in long lines, perpendicular to the river. When looking at a map of the region, this pattern is impossible to ignore. And it's anything but some quirk. It's a feature of a landscape built for industrial ease.
And the long lots, I mean, the plantations were long lots too, right? Everything runs perpendicular to the river.
Yeah.
Everything.
Yeah.
That's normal here. That's the settlement pattern. It
Yeah.
follows the French colonial landholding pattern.
Wow.
And the value of this land is the river frontage, but you don't need that much river frontage. You just need one spot, right? So, I mean, the land itself is worth not that much money. It's the batcher. The most valuable part of land, if you own land here, is owning the batcher, which is the section of the river frontage on this side.
And we own the batcher.
Yeah, the batcher.
We own our batcher.
You own your batcher?
Yeah.
Sure.
Because I walked over on it, so.
That's
There
the
you
most
go.
valuable real estate. I mean, some of the most valuable real estate in the country. I mean, per unit land.
If you didn't catch it, that's Miss Sharon at the end saying, "We own our batcher." Her house is across the street from the levee that runs along the river, but the land right up to the river is hers. A batcher is just the English version of a French word for riverbank. Owning this batcher is a big deal for many reasons, one of which is that if Miss Sharon owns it, then the industry can't use it. Access to the Mississippi River is what drew the sugarcane plantation industry to these banks. Fertile land with readily available access to the biggest transportation thoroughfare in the country. It's the same thing that drew the petrochemical industry to Louisiana. Well, one of the things. We'll get to that. The next bit of tape from the Toxic Tour is a bit chaotic as we get in and out of the car.
So all these most of the plants will have these kinds of little arms that go across.
Yeah.
And this is feedstocks coming in. Coal comes in that way, with some of them, and stuff coming in and stuff going out.
Wow.
Both ways?
Both ways. Yeah, both ways. Because most of the stuff is loaded up onto, ships. It's heavy. We don't make finished product. we have, intermediate parts of the supply chain.
In case you didn't hear that, Adam said, we don't make finished products. We have intermediate parts of the supply chain.
Which are, maybe not coincidentally, the parts of the supply chain that produce the least amount of value.
Wow.
And the most amount of pollution.
Correct.
So there's
So this is the break bulk point.
so the potential for harm is high and the potential for benefit is low
Correct.
for
Yeah.
the inhabitant.
There are almost no finished products that are produced here. It's all intermediate stages of production.
Sounds like another product we've heard a bit about. Sugarcane. Like many petrochemicals, sugarcane was a product made and processed here, then shipped down the Mississippi to be turned into final products elsewhere. Essentially, what Adam is saying is that what usually leaves Cancer Alley is not a finished product. If built, the Formosa plant in St. James Parish would transform the byproducts of fossil fuels into little plastic pellets. Those pellets would then be sent to places like New Jersey to be turned into final plastic products, which is a big deal when it comes to something very important: jobs.
If you have a job as an operator in plant, union or non-union, but especially union, it's a very good job.
Yeah.
I mean, the breathing stuff is not nice.
How much could you make at a job like that?
I mean, 6 figures.
6 figures?
But basically, as far as, really, good jobs, like a truly good job here that doesn't require a college education, that's it.
Mm-hmm.
It's working in the plant.
Yeah.
But there aren't that many jobs.
The petrochemical industry and its political supporters love to talk about all of the jobs it creates in this region, a region where people need jobs. Remember, this is a rural, low-income community of color. One person's 6-figure job is a huge, generation-changing deal.
Often when industry moves into an area, there's like, we're going to bring X many jobs. It's going to, boost the economy. It's going to have all of these positive economic effects.
This is Gianna St. Julian again.
But often, we were hearing that the people who were living in these areas weren't the ones who were actually receiving the jobs. Basically, we were able to see that there were a lot of employment disparities in, high-paying jobs versus low-paying jobs on the county and state level. And then seeing that a lot of the predominantly Black areas, that they were not experiencing that kind of economic job growth and not receiving a lot of the employment.
And while there are absolutely people from fence-line communities who have jobs at the plants, for example, Miss Sharon's brothers worked at Shell Oil for most of their careers, the number of high-paying, sustainable jobs that go to community members does not support the claim that the industry creates endless jobs. And that's intentional. Remember when I said that industry isn't in Cancer Alley by accident? That it isn't next to low-income Black communities by accident? Or, like Adam said, that these industries don't make final products, once again, not by accident? Well, sociologist Barbara Allen, in her book Uneasy Alchemy, theorizes that industries decided to build intermediary products in Cancer Alley because this requires a low number of very specialized jobs and far higher automation than final product processing. Work like this requires a small, highly educated workforce that can be brought in from elsewhere. This would then mean that a plant wouldn't need to rely on a local workforce and therefore wouldn't provide jobs to the communities they pollute. Louisiana has one of the lowest education rates in the country, especially among rural Black communities. And to add to that cycle, Louisiana has one of the largest tax exemption programs for industry in the country. These exemptions deprive communities of the much-needed economic input for their local services, like schools, roads, and vital social services.
The people in the areas are not receiving the benefits, so-called benefits of these types of projects, and are only kind of receiving the horrible end of it. The pollution, the exposures, the land being taken away, things like that. These are companies that are receiving billions of dollars in tax exemptions and promising as few as 23 jobs. It's a bit absurd when you really look at the data. Ultimately, it's always going to be appealing to industry if they're the ones that are going to receive these large tax breaks.
The promise of jobs to justify loss of human life claim seems to be the favorite defensive argument of industrial growth in the river parishes. It's held aloft as this golden chalice of success that everything else, health, safety, human lives, should be sacrificed for. Instead of bringing vitality and work to communities, industry is suffocating everything that allows a community to thrive. Like in the 5th District of St. James Parish, where industry bought the post office and turned it into a chemical lab.
When you go a little bit further, you're going to see our post office that they bought. And they made a lab out of it. This was our post office right here.
And where industry bought and blocked an important evacuation route.
The gate back there, that was an evacuation route for us.
An evacuation route?
Yes, when a hurricane would come, you can go down this street here and go through those gates and go to the next highway. When New Star came, or years later, they put a fence there and blocked that driveway, that evacuation route. And now we don't have an evacuation route in the 5th District.
Are you serious?
Yes, I am.
And for the absolute cherry on top,
and this is where our school, when you go up a little bit further, you'll see our school.
Coke Methanol owns the former high school. That's Coke, like the big oil climate denying Koch brothers. And yeah, they own the high school and use it as office headquarters.
My classroom was right there on the bottom. First door right down there. And so my class, and our cafeteria was over there.
The people of the 5th Ward of St. James don't have a public high school anymore. The kids have to go up the road 10 miles. They don't have a post office anymore. Their main evacuation route is closed off. Their parks are closed or bought out. They can't sit out on their porches after 5 p.m. when the smokestacks are flaring. Their church is silhouetted by storage tanks. Industrial infrastructure has laid claim to everything they hold dear. But this place is still theirs.
When you're taking away, just resources, day-to-day life, you're making it harder and harder for them to live. Their ancestors have lived here before industry was even a thing. I think often, people hear about these concerns and they wonder, well, if we know there's a problem, like, why don't these people leave? And I think it's a bit absurd to ask someone to, uproot their lives and leave the place that their ancestors have lived in and they've raised their families, just a place with this type of history. I think it's important to protect these types of things. And I think asking a person to leave just because industry is moving into their area and wants to get away with these types of pollutant levels, I think it's just a bit absurd. And I think it's important to not only, protect obviously the history of these areas, but respect that these people have lived there their entire lives and, have a right to live there.
This land, this beautiful, fertile, biodiverse, unique land, has been valued for its economic use since sugarcane was first planted in its soil for a profit. The people forced to work this land were valued for their economic use over their human rights. And the lives of their descendants who still live on this land are once again valued as less than the land's economic use. Here's Jo Banner once again.
What I've heard was, you have nothing in your town. You're small, you're dying out. You need us, essentially. This business is going to come to save you and make something of you. So they can define what infrastructure looks like. They have no idea of the infrastructure that's already been placed there, which is the infrastructure of the soil, the infrastructure of the water, the infrastructure of plants and trees. Having disconnection to that will make it seem like, well, yeah, we don't have anything. And that's not the truth. I know the history. I know those cane fields have been cane fields that were in place since my ancestors put those cane fields down there, and they're still being used. So that's infrastructure that's part of our community. The soil that's been maintained, the land, that's all part of infrastructure. That's all part of history, and just the fact that we're there. And the fabric of the community is us, the blood and everything that happened there in the history.
It's just so beautiful out here. I see what makes it such a fantastic opportunity to like offer people a space for learning and healing and reflection. Like, it's kind of feels like it emanates in the space already.
Standing in a quiet grove of skyscraping live oaks and looking down over the flourishing green land that is the Woodland Plantation, land owned by two Black women, descendants of enslaved people. It feels radical. In a place where land and history are so deeply interwoven, and land ownership is and has been a weapon of immense violence, reclaiming this land is a chance to reclaim this history and a chance to heal.
Wherever there was a plantation, there was at least one burial ground for the enslaved. At least one. So all throughout this land, our ancestors are buried. You can't just call it that empty space. There's nothing on it. Oh, there's nothing on it. Our ancestors are resting there. And the only land that these people owned was the spots where they died in, where they were buried in, and maybe a tree that's still standing if they're lucky. So that's nothing to you. That's everything to me.
Something that really surprised me when I was at Woodland was how much I loved being there. Before I arrived, I'd expected to feel some sort of repulsion or disgust or, I don't know, some deep wrongness in being on plantation land and in the plantation house itself.
I oddly feel like I'm gonna miss this place.
Aw.
You know, it's odd. I don't really expect to feel that way, but I'm like, kind of sad to leave it.
But it didn't feel wrong. It felt like something else, something less nameable.
I think would be such an important healing space for people. And look, we are not, one thing too, I don't want, you can come here and have emotion, obviously. You can have emotion, and we don't want you to come in here and being stiff or feeling like you have to be buttoned up. This place is going to be one where I hope all people can just feel what they need to feel.
Absolutely. Love to hear that.
Jo made it so clear in her tour and her description of the land and house that this was Black people land. Famous jazz trumpet player Kid Ory was born on this land and created incredible music here. The homes were designed with West African knowledge, wide and facing the river for good ventilation. The thumbprints of Black builders aerating the mortar between bricks are still visible in the walls. Other than the Whitney Plantation in Jo's hometown of Wallace, all the plantation museums in the river parishes tell the story of the white people, land-owning, enslaving white people. But that's not the whole story of this land.
It's just gorgeous. I think sometimes it's hard to imagine terrible things happening in beautiful places, you know? It's like you're in it and you see it and it's like, how could anybody who had access to this want to do this, do you know?
All can exist.
Extraction and violence are so intricately woven into the past and present of Cancer Alley. But what about the future of this place? Can a future exist where these forces recede into memory? What would that future look like? We'll save that for next week in our final episode of this mini-series. Until then, Kid Ory, take us out. Into the Mix is a Ben & Jerry's podcast produced with Vox Creative. This episode was written by Jules Bradley. The Vox Creative team includes lead producers Priscilla Alabi and Jules Bradley, production supervisor Taylor Henry, and production manager Jessica Bay. Martha D. Sally is our supervising producer. Anu Subramanian is our executive producer. The team also includes Amy Wenzel, Senior Manager of Creative Services, Michelle Blam, Associate Director of Project Management, Director of Post-Production Greg Russ, and Post-Production Manager Andrew Hammond. Kyle Neal engineered this episode. Felicia Dominguez is our junior engineer. Original music by Israel Tutson. A special thank you to Mary Anais Hegler, our sensitivity reader, and Zoe Malik, our fact checker, for their expertise, and to Ariane Young for her support. The Ben & Jerry's team includes Jay Tandon, Jay Curley, Sanjana Mahesh, Chris Miller, and Palika Makam. We also like to thank Jordan Brewington for their time and knowledge, and the Years Project for providing a clip from their short documentary, Fighting Polluting Industry in Cancer Alley, for use in this series. Featured in this series was additional music including Somber Healing, produced by Christian Romo, courtesy of YR Media. Oh Freedom, arranged and performed by Rise St. James, and Society Blues, written and performed by Kid Ory's Sunshine Orchestra. I'm Ashley C. Ford. Thank you for listening.
Vox Creative.